My name is Alonza Robertson. As I mentioned in the emails, I work in the media relations department at Lehman, and we write about a lot of different things going on at the college, and we were very impressed by the research that you all had done and the story that the Intercept had published. And we thought it would be interesting to talk to you a little bit and gain some insights about how this all came about and what you learned, and what some of the students may feel that the next step should be in terms of the reaction to their work.
I'm so impressed by the work that all of the students and especially this little crew was able to do. I often teach my investigative classes with this idea that, all right, we'll all work on a project together. We'll really dig into something. I definitely believe that the way to teach journalism is to do journalism. I think that's how you and I certainly learned, right? In our first couple jobs, we became reporters because we were working as reporters, whether at high school or college newspapers or community newspapers or whatever. So I feel like the best journalism education is really just doing it. So in this second level class, I always try to teach it as this investigative project where the whole team works together on something. And this one worked really well. As Aman was saying, David Cruz, he was the editor of the Norwood News. He's now an editor at Gothamist, but he and I have known each other for a long time. I live in the neighborhood that his paper covers, and we have a nice relationship. So he came to me last fall and said, hey, I did this FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, and got this whole giant database of all of the lawsuits that the city has paid out settlements for because of allegations of abuse by the NYPD. It's a giant data set. Do you think it might be of use to your class? Could your students work on it? As you know, so much of reporting, especially this sort of level of investigative reporting, it's really slow. It's really time consuming. It's really tedious, frankly, right? Like getting a big byline on a splashy story is exciting, but it's months and months of really tedious and kind of boring work before that. And so David came to me saying, like, I've got some tedious work. Might your students be interested in doing it? We need a little army of worker bees, right, to parse this information, because as we know, like a big set of data, you actually need a journalist to tell the story that's in that data, right? The city had done its legal job by revealing the public information, but it didn't make sense to anybody, right? Like no citizen of New York could read that database and know what it meant, even if the legal requirement of making public information available had been met. You actually need journalists and trained journalists to parse that information and make it a story. So David came to me saying, like, hey, maybe this would be a project for your class. And so I built a semester around using that, and the students just did a great job really wading into it. I mean, I think you guys will remember that in February and March, we didn't know what to make of it. Like, we didn't know what story was in that data. It was just I keep using these sort of like water metaphor, right? We had to dive in, we were immersed, we had to wade into it. We felt like we were drowning, and eventually are able to find a story within it, which is what they did such a great job of in the end.
So the information came to you as like an Excel file, and you created different filters or sorts to try to look for trends, or how did that work?
That's right. It came as this giant Excel file, and maybe Jennifer wants to talk about how we cut it up.
The data sheet was all 5 boroughs, and we were all just kind of like taking chunks and trying to look up the court records for it, and just not really sure what direction to take it in. And then the turning point was when we decided to just focus on the Bronx. We're here in the Bronx, Lehman's in the Bronx, and that was huge enough. That was, I mean, Aman, David, that was still thousands and thousands of lawsuits settled for the Bronx in the past 5 years. So once we settled into the Bronx, then we started looking for patterns. And one thing we noticed was that there was a number of officers' names from throughout precincts in the Bronx that were showing up again and again. And again, the data only went back like 5 years. So that stood out to us. And we started calling them like frequent flyers or the repeat offenders. And then we started, we were still in classes before the shutdown. So I do remember we all decided to take like one of these repeat offenders that had like 10 or more lawsuits against them. And we would, drill down into that, officer, find out their story. And we also divided up precincts. I think there was about like one precinct per person. And I think around that time was when we ended up, the school went online. And so then we continued to meet as a class through WebEx or Zoom, and continued to share our findings. So I can't speak for anyone else. I know that once I kind of got the key to the courtroom files, I just kind of really burrowed into a rabbit hole and just finding complaints for a bunch of the different claimants, and other people were too, and we were all sharing Google documents. And it just kind of whittled down.
So once you got the information about the different settlements that they had settled or lawsuits that were brought against them, you tried to correlate that with a court case to try to figure out what happened, or what? Help me figure out what was going on with the court files with the settlement files.
Well, we had names. So we had, the name of the claimant, and there would also be the case file record. It didn't always line up. Like if we were to search, I don't know if David or Mon, if you tried this, but sometimes you would put in the case file number that was in that spreadsheet and search it in a court and it wouldn't come up. But we found we had more luck by searching the names of the claimants, and sometimes the names of the officers. And then whether that was for the Southern District of New York or in the Bronx Supreme Court, then their case files would come up, and that would have the initial complaint, which would have the narrative, like sort of the statement of the facts of what happened. We got a lot of our information about like what was happening from those complaints. And then it would also have, you'd sort of be able to follow the case through, like there was the compliance conferences and then up to the settlement. And David, looking at those complaints, I thought that was being able to access so many of them, and that's where we also saw patterns. Usually false arrests with some excessive force. A lot of these lawsuits follow similar patterns.
So basically, we also use CapStat. CapStat allowed us to look up the officers one by one. It showed us what kind of arrest the officers made, whether they were false arrests or permitted and allowed. And majority of the time, we found that many of the officers that had complaints made against them were all based off false arrests. Like, I believe the officer that I was assigned was Thomas McHale from the 44th precinct. And some of his arrests were that he arrested somebody just without any actual purpose. Like, he just saw him outside of a hotel and just believed he had, drugs on him and he was selling drugs. And the victim complained that he had excessive force used against him. And ironically enough, a year later, 1 year exact, he was arrested for the same thing again by the same officer, and under the same false charges. Like, the guy didn't have anything on him. And we just kind of felt like that was a repeating pattern, that they were just, racially profiling many of these victims.
How ironic that your work came along this spring when the whole world turned on its head, where some people didn't want to believe, and then others thought that they had had enough. But the two forces came together, and now you all had data to prove. How ironic was that?
Yeah, I remember, because we'd been working on this story since the beginning of February, and then even throughout, the shutdown, meeting regularly. And it took a while for it to come together. So yeah, I just remember, thinking like, oh no, we're gonna get scooped, which is, when these terrible things are happening, is like the wrong thing to think.
But there was an article, maybe when we were still meeting in person, right? There was an article, Graham Raymond, who's reported on excessive policing and police abuse for years and years, wrote a book. He's a reporter at the Daily News. He had a little article in February, and I remember reading that article and coming to class and be like, oh God, we got to get our work done, because look, we're sitting on this big story, but look, we're getting scooped by the Daily News, and I know that we've got more. We've got better reporting, deeper knowledge, more of a story than this thing that appeared in the Daily News, but feeling that competitive pressure, right, from a working press publication. And then really the semester was well over when George Floyd was killed and the protests against his
that was the Memorial Day, or
right, it was like around Memorial Day that all those
Oh,
protests
okay.
kicked off. But we were still working on this project, right? We, you know, the semester ended in the middle of May, but the story didn't. I knew that I wanted the story to be rewritten into a package that I could sell to a publication to actually publish it for us. And so this crew of students and a couple of others, you know, stayed with me, even though the semester is over, even though the grades were in, kept working and kept rewriting and kept fact checking. And then, yes, when George Floyd was killed and the protests around his death like popped off everywhere, I said, oh man, we have deep, deep data that is not anecdotal. And this was one of the reasons I was interested in pursuing this project. Our student body thinks about policing. Most of our students are students of color. Many of our students are from the Bronx. Many of our students have experience, especially the male students, frankly, have experience of negative encounters with the police. Some of our students are on the police force or have relatives who are in it. But I'm always thinking as a journalism professor, how do we take something that people care about and how do I teach a quantitative way of thinking about it? How do I teach a journalism way of thinking about it? And of course, like consciousness and outrage around excessive policing and police abuse didn't begin with George Floyd's killing. There were various sort of cycles of protest in the last couple of years, right? And sometimes students are involved in those. And so they have a lot of polemic, they have a lot of opinion, they have a lot of passion. And my work as a professor is to say, like, well, so what can journalism bring to that conversation that's different than I feel this is wrong, or I made a sign, I went to a protest, right? Like those are important aspects of being a citizen. But journalism does this different thing, and it brings facts. It brings like the heavy firepower of fact and research and verification and fact checking. So in choosing this project as the thing that the class would work on, I was very much conscious of the fact that it would be a good teaching tool for, all right, so you care about excessive policing. Your brother has been arrested, or you've been thrown up against a wall, or you've had this negative encounter. Great. Now let's show what journalism can do for it. It's very different than tweeting. It's very different than shouting. And I really wanted to demonstrate to the class that we do this thing that is really different. So you can say, I feel like the NYPD is racially profiling people in my neighborhood because my brother had this thing happen to him and I had this thing happen to me. Or you can look at a database of 7,000 court cases and spend 3 months reading through legal proceedings and analyze numbers and come up with a heavily documented, carefully and tediously researched report and say, all right, here's what we know, right? It's different than this realm of passion and opinion. And hopefully, those facts are just out there, right? And we know because of the very rigorous fact check that the Intercept put us through, we can feel really confident about those facts. And then people can read them and do with them what they like. Maybe the next time people go to a protest, they can say, look, here's some facts, right? And that's the thing that we can contribute as journalists. Or maybe people will read these and take some other analysis out of them, right? Say, well, there's 1.3 million people in the Bronx, this many lawsuits isn't so much. But in any case, what we've presented is cold and measured and rational.
Well, I think it's very pertinent also and relevant that Lehman is in the Bronx. You all have a history of in the Bronx, or you live there yourselves. And this one telling fact just stood out in my mind when I read your report again, that between 2015 and 2019, if there's the $30 million paid out in 2019 for those lawsuits, was 45% of all the money paid out across the city. That's shocking. That's shocking. Almost half of the cases are in the Bronx for the entire city. That's very alarming.
And it was fairly spread out too. I mean, we're not talking like, oh, in just the 41st in the Southwest Bronx, that's where it's all happening. I mean, didn't you guys feel that, we all had pretty much equal work when we split the Bronx up into precincts. I mean, it was happening everywhere. That was also the interesting thing about the past reporting classes and reporting I've done, outside of school has been always like covering something. Like if there was a violent arrest or people were accusing the police or something, you might go and cover it. But just coming at it from an investigative standpoint was kind of different for me, as far as, let's dig into the data, let's see what the stories are here. And then, just so many things started coming out of it once you kept digging. Like a lot of stuff even ended up on the cutting room floor. Like, why aren't these officers, how are they able to continue to be part of these settlements that cost the city so much money? Why why are they still on the street doing the exact same arrests? Why are they getting promoted? Isn't there any accountability? And then we started looking into qualified immunity. Oh, well, they enjoy qualified immunity, then there's really no connection between the sort of bad arrests that they make and the damage they cause and their everyday job of policing the streets. If Eileen didn't force us to suddenly okay, we have to wrap this up, that we would still be reporting, would still be digging right now. That was really made me want to focus my future journalistic endeavors on the investigative side of reporting.
Any of your reactions to how people maybe responded to the report once they read it?
Yeah, David, do you want to talk?
Okay, I'm okay with talking. A lot of what I did on the report itself was just research. So a lot of the stuff that I can talk about is really just like case files and stuff. I'm glad it was received well, the story in general. Specifically amongst a lot of my friends and a lot of the people that I know. I kind of teased them for a while. Like I'm like, hey, there's this pretty big story. I read the contract. It doesn't exactly, I'm not under like an NDA. I could tell you guys what it is, but I don't want to. One, just in case, and two, because I want you guys to, really read this and be shocked, right? Like this is our city and you guys should know what's happening within it. And amongst them, they were pretty shocked about it. There's one friend who I know he meant this seriously, where he said that if he sees a police officer down the same sidewalk as him, he's going to go to the other sidewalk. Not out of disrespect, but because he's legitimately afraid that he's just going to get targeted for something random. And I don't know, I guess it's really scary. To me, working on this, even if I was just going through case files and sorting things out, it put a lot of things into perspective because these police officers, they swear oaths. And I mean, I'm a pretty big nerd, right? So in a lot of like the fantasy games and stuff like that I play, swearing an oath is a pretty big thing. It means you devote your life to it. Police officers are supposed to be these heroes, I guess. If something happens to you, if you feel unsafe, if you feel like your life is threatened or your possessions are threatened, you should be able to go to a police officer. They should jump to help you, right? You should have a good experience with them. But now it feels like, for a long time, actually, for my whole life, it feels like the police couldn't ever be trusted. And it's a terrible thing. It really is.
It's sort of a culture of this sort of abusive policing. And we could only speak to the Bronx because that's what we dug into. But that was one thing we all sort of concluded pretty early on, that this seems to be a widely accepted way to police a city where people are afraid. They're afraid to walk down the street. They could be arrested, once and sue and get a settlement, and then there could be retaliation against them. Officers are afraid to speak up if they, are bothered by the way their fellow officers are policing.
How much the police, just to understand the police's position on this, they seem to feel that a lot of these things are frivolous, or it's better to pay this off than continuous litigation that's not going to go anywhere. How much of this are these cases very bad cases versus convoluted, and then we have to filter down the very bad, like to get to the center of the problem? And how many people never even file that might be being abused at the same time, just to be balanced on how we look at it?
Right. So one of the things we worked on kind of by the middle of the semester is trying to get a real and robust police response. We made efforts to try to get in touch with the officers whose names kept coming up, the officers who we realized were going to be the ones that we reported on. And Jennifer and other students reached out to DCPI, to the Deputy Commissioner of Public Information, like the spokesperson for the department, and I know Aman and Michael and some other students, it was their job to call the precincts, right? And talk to the desk sergeant and say, hey, we're working on this story. Because one principle of journalism is that you never want the people who appear in your story to be surprised to see their name in the newspaper, right? Like, that's just not fair, that's just not polite. So we were working on this story for months. We wanted, just out of sort of like civility, we wanted the police to know that we were working on this story. But really, we would have understood things better, right? There's more to learn. The more people you speak to, there's more things that you could learn. And we would have understood the context of what was happening or what is happening on the streets of the Bronx better if we could have gotten the police to actually talk to us, right? But they didn't. Eventually we got a response, or Jennifer got a response from DCPI that was very much because DCPI learns that, oh, those kids from Lehman College actually are going to be published in an international publication of great repute. Okay, so now we're going to call her back. She's been calling like weekly since February or March. Finally, they called her back when she said, actually, it's Jennifer Kelly from the Intercept, which, you know, we've all experienced as reporters, especially as freelancers. Depending on who you're writing for, you get different level of respect and callback. But, you know, you're asking, like, how much are these outliers? How much are these par for the course sort of cases? And I mean, I sincerely wish that we could have had frank interviews and conversations with all different levels within the NYPD, right? The Deputy Commissioner of Public Information, but also precinct commanders and police on the street, and police who are partnered with or work the same shifts as the people whose names appeared in our article, because then we would have understood more, right? So one of the kind of superpowers of investigative journalism is that actually you can report on things just with the documents. If no one spoke to us, we could have told most of this story, right? We were able to tell the story with like more flesh and blood because Ms. Gonzalez spoke to us and a few other of the plaintiffs spoke to us. But actually we could have told the whole story, much of the story, just from what was written in the lawsuit, which is one of the things I like to teach, that like the documents tell the story and the documents are there. But of course we would know and we would understand better a really significant issue if the police had spoken to us. And so I think of that as a loss. Like, I'm humble enough to admit, right, that there's things, of course, there's vast things I don't understand about policing. And there's vast things I don't understand about the culture within a department and the mindset and thinking that goes into how they do their job. And with all of the ink spilled around policing in the last 6 months, right, last 4 months, we'd be better informed if police officers spoke more or were free to answer questions to the press, right? But then your other question about are these frivolous is really interesting. So I think that's a fairly common reaction among maybe people who think more along the sides of the police, right, or the city, that, oh, all right, whatever, you slip and fall, you file a lawsuit, right? Like, lots of people file lawsuits and it doesn't mean that there's much validity to them.
I only say that because I read a reaction from a quote from one of them in a story where they tried to reiterate it in that particular way. So that's
yeah, exactly. No, I think that's like a common sort of defense or even like a psychological sort of deflection, right? Jennifer's reporting revealed that, in fact, the city of New York, under somewhat counterintuitively, maybe under Mayor de Blasio, has devoted a lot of energy to knocking out so-called frivolous lawsuits. A whole unit that is just devoted to getting rid of and getting dismissed lawsuits that they think don't rise to the level of serious offenses. And therefore, that means that those ones that do go forward have sort of been like stress tested, right? Like, those lawsuits that the city does settle are pretty serious because they're the ones that the city didn't get rid of. They actually have a whole unit devoted to getting rid of frivolous lawsuits. Whether those are really frivolous or not, it's been an enforcement goal of this administration under de Blasio to shed a certain level of them, which just means that the ones that do get through are significant, right? They're the ones that got through this narrower sort of a sieve.
And these are all ones that the city decided to settle. I mean, if they thought that they could, get the case dismissed or on a summary judgment, they would have, and they did in some cases. And the police weren't willing to speak with us or couldn't, but a lot of people were. I talked to the lawyers who represented some of the plaintiffs, and they also directed us to things to look for in the data, like the arrest quotas, which are supposedly, haven't happened since, around the time that stop and frisk ended, which I was also told by different social justice leaders, like Juan Cartagena, that it still happens in the Bronx. The litigation, part of that lawsuit might be over, but now that NYPD is under like federal oversight, it's supposed to be improving its practices. Talking to someone from the Legal Aid Society who had that great CAPSTAT database, which really, it's fleshed out a lot of the lawsuits we were looking at in the spreadsheet. They deal with people who have been, wronged or abused by the police, all the time, and represent them. So talking to everyone sort of around the police who was willing to talk to us gave us a lot of insight in sort of the patterns and practices that they, as being deeply involved in exposing, police misconduct and trying to hold police accountable. They had a lot of insights, and that kind of brought aspects of the data we might not have paid attention to life.
So I just want to ask one last question, just as your thoughts. What happens next? Where does your research go next? What do you think the reaction should be next? Do you feel that you've done enough to quell this thing of fake news? There's no fundamental systematic racism in policing. I mean, like, how do you feel like to address people who say it doesn't exist and you have, yes, does? And then what are you going to do about it? Tell the world what you're going to do next after what you've learned.
Hopefully it goes to something bigger, something, way better. And especially in the climate of, topics that we're in today with everything going on with social justice and the fight for, Black Lives Matter and everything like that. Hopefully it goes to something better. Like, we have the evidence, like, it's in front of the entire world right now. Like, everything that we presented, there's nothing false about it. It's all straight from statistics and stats. What we're doing is basically just pushing a narrative and pushing a message that these things do happen. Just because it doesn't happen in somebody else's backyard doesn't mean it's not happening, somewhere else. And like, we're hoping to get these messages received positively by people of all colors and different types of, neighborhoods and things like that. We're hoping for a better change. That was like the point of this, for people to realize that, especially within the Bronx, where it's like the second highest crime rates of New York City, that a lot of these things are happening in our own backyard. And we want others to know that when we say that things like Black Lives Matter, we mean that the positions that we grew up in, that it shouldn't be a thing. Like, we deserve better. These communities deserve better. And that's the message that we're trying to push out, especially with the article that we wrote.
I don't know where this will go. I thought that this story, believe it or not, I thought it would be much bigger. I was actually afraid at some point that it would add a lot of fuel to the fire, and we would kind of be seen, or we would kind of get some flack because, maybe like the situation would change and things would get drastic. And I was kind of afraid of that. But it almost feels now like, in a way, almost as if no one read it, or everyone just flew by everyone's heads. And it's not that I wanted it to explode and be big and cause all these drastic things. I would like to continue working on this kind of thing because I do think we can cause some kind of positive change, but it's scary. Like, even if I have good intentions, even if we all have good intentions, like, could we spark something? Or could we snowball something? Like, how much bigger can this get? But at the very least, I suppose I should take both pride in the idea that it's not like we're fabricating a story. This is all real. This is statistic based. And even though we're against police abuse and the like, it's also very objective. It's statistics based. So it's very hard to argue with statistics. But yeah, I would like to work on it again. I personally, I think I need to shake off the feeling that I'm going to end up causing something something big?
What we did was provide the public with fairly crucial information. I mean, if you don't care about abusive policing, maybe you care about how many of your tax dollars are going to fund abusive policing. And then there's a couple of things that happened in the course of our reporting, in addition to, George Floyd and the protest. And it was earlier that our reporting kind of gave some context to, for instance, COVID, when the shutdown happened, and the police were enforcing masks and the shutdown, and the disproportionate arrests, in the Bronx, as opposed to walking up and asking someone to put their mask on, like throwing them down to the sidewalk. I mean, we started to see that on the news. Even a plaintiff that I talked to, Shakima Gonzalez, who was quoted in the story, said seeing that happen in her neighborhood was sort of re-traumatizing her. And then the other thing that happened was in the beginning of our reporting, it was really hard to find police misconduct files because of Law 50A, which is part of the state's civil code, which said you couldn't, the city didn't have to release any sort of misconduct reports or discipline files on officers. And a lot of people that lawyers at Lee Way Society said, this is what makes it so hard. We've been trying to get this law repealed for years. And then right towards the end of our reporting, it was repealed. So it didn't really help us as far as getting, some of these files that would have been, with some of these frequent offenders, officers, it'd been great to be able to get their disciplinary records. But, I guess it was immediately repealed and they're still kind of holding them up. But so I think going forward, hopefully those kind of records are more readily available. So we can continue this kind of reporting, but with, more information from the police, whether they talk to us or not, their personnel files can speak kind of for them, their actions, when they're policing streets can speak for them as well. So there was a number of other stories that I came up with while I was writing this one, and talking to different people. I've got a massive file of future story ideas that I want to keep working on. So I'm just hoping with the sources that we developed in the course of this, that all these different organizations that have had their eye on the police for years, and now with 50A being repealed, that when we go to do our next investigative story, we kind of have all the resources sort of there, and we know kind of how to navigate the data, as opposed to this being a learning process and it's still turning into this great, robust, kind of deep piece. We're kind of, with Eileen's guidance, of course, figuring out as we went. So I feel optimistic that the next time we're going to do a project like this, we have all the tools because of doing this project together.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm a former journalist myself. I've worked for several years with different papers, as Eileen mentioned, and you all are to be commended. It's a very good piece, and we're very happy to be able to share it. And Eileen, I want to give you the last 30 seconds to share with the folks that might be watching why it's important of what you're doing in terms of training up journalists who understand how to use data and technology, so that we don't have a lot of coup journalists or citizen journalists creating fake news.
Right. Yeah, I feel really strongly that this is a important piece of a liberal arts education. Really, is investigating. Is investigating what's true, right? I mean, in a classic sense, going to the university to study truth. This is what we do as part of an Enlightenment project. That's what a liberal arts education does, is we're on this quest for truth, and that takes different forms in different types of classes, in philosophy class or in a political science class or in literature classes. And so I see journalism as part of that liberal arts education, in a slightly different measure, that we're also trying to be accurate, and that we measure things and that we check facts. And so journalism education exists in this sort of funny way within the university. It's both part of the long Enlightenment quest to understand what's real and to build up strong citizens, right, regardless of immigration status or passport holding, but in terms of members of a society, strong citizens. But also it's very different than a lot of the other sorts of things that you learn while in college. in that it's these practical skills. And I love teaching it at Lehman because our students come in with really great expertise in a lot of areas that students from other places, students in other schools don't have. There's so much that I don't have to teach Lehman students because they already understand things. And then in terms of, all right, so here's the skills. Here's how we check something. Here's how we write this sort of a sentence. Here's how we build a nut graph. Sure, that I can teach, and that you can teach to anybody. I think in doing projects like this with my Lehman classes, what it shows is that we can have very, very, very high standards, right? We can have very high expectations for the level of work, the level of reporting, the level of skill that we can expect for our students. Sometimes that's not what happens in a college class, but I think because, like you, as a working journalist for so long, I only think of stories as like, well, who's actually going to want to read this? Are we actually uncovering any information?
Right.
Is this publishable? And so my standards are around like, could this get in tomorrow's newspaper if I were still at a newspaper, right? Could this get on the air if I were still at a radio station? And it's good to keep those level of standards because look, the students can do it, right? The students can rise to that level with the right training and with the scaffolding of skilled teaching. You actually can do very serious work with undergrads. If you are able to think in those terms as a professor, in terms of the really high standards of what we want our students to be doing, and you combine that with the great expertise that our students come in with because of the lives they lead, because of the neighborhoods they live in, then it's really unstoppable reporting that we can do together. Right. And I just want to commend these students and the rest of the class who did this. It's really exciting when you get the byline, and it's really exciting when you see your story out in the Intercept, but months and months of not exciting work to get to the big story, and they did a great job with that.
It's kind of exciting. I mean, if you're kind of nerds like we are, like.
Bylines are forever. And important bylines last even longer than that.
Right.
Thank you. And I wish all of you the best, and we look forward to seeing your next work that we can share with the rest of the world as well.